She just wanted a peaceful place to wait for her child to be born, but her boss had other plans, and no one expected a horse to change everything. If you love animals like I do, subscribe to the channel and watch all our stories. The Rolling hills of Willow Creek, Kentucky, stretched as far as the eye could see, their lush green curves dotted with thoroughbreds worth more than most people's homes. Nestled between these hills stood Blackwood Estate, a sprawling horse farm known throughout the state for its champion racing stallions and the cold, calculating man who owned them. Emily Matthews drove her beat-up Honda along the winding gravel road, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting protectively on her swollen belly. At 6 months pregnant, she had exhausted all other options. After losing her job as a nurse's assistant at the Lexington Hospital due to budget cuts, and with the baby's father long gone, Emily had answered an ad for live-in help at Blackwood Estate with the desperate hope that it would provide stability until she could figure out her next move. The main house came into view, an imposing structure of stone and glass that seemed to both belong to and dominate the landscape. In the distance, she could see the training rings, stables and worker accommodations, a small, self-contained world ruled by Richard Blackwood, a man whose reputation preceded him throughout the bluegrass state. The estate manager, a thin woman, named Margaret with perpetually pursed lips, met Emily at the entrance. "Mr. Blackwood doesn't like to be kept waiting," she said by way of greeting, eyeing Emily's pregnant belly with thinly veiled disapproval. "He's agreed to hire you despite your condition. You should be grateful." Emily swallowed her pride and nodded. Grateful wasn't exactly what she felt, but she needed this job. Margaret led her to a small cabin near the stables. "This will be your quarters. Your duties include cleaning the main house, preparing lunch for the staff, and helping with the horses. Mr. Blackwood expects all employees to be up by 5 a.m., no exceptions." After Margaret left, Emily sat on the narrow bed and let out a long breath. The cabin was sparse but clean, a bed, a dresser, a tiny bathroom, and a kitchenette. Through the window, she could see the stables and, beyond them, the rolling pastures where several horses grazed. She unpacked her few belongings, changed into work clothes, and decided to familiarize herself with the grounds before darkness fell. The stables were immaculate, with polished wooden stalls housing some of the most beautiful thoroughbreds Emily had ever seen. Each horse had its name and lineage displayed proudly on a plaque: Thunder's Legacy, Midnight Gallop, Kentucky Royalty. These were million-dollar animals, bred for speed and victory. At the far end of the stable, separated from the others, was a stall without a plaque. Inside stood a massive white stallion, his coat dulled by dust, his powerful frame somehow diminished by the shadows. Unlike the other horses, who moved forward curiously when Emily approached, this one remained still, watching her with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold a deep wariness. "That's Spirit," came a voice behind her. Emily turned to see a stable hand, a weathered man in his 60s. "Mr. Blackwood's old show horse. Not much use for him now that he can't win ribbons anymore." "What happened to him?" Emily asked, drawn to the stallion's quiet dignity. "Nothing happened. Just got older, less showy. Mr. Blackwood only keeps him around because selling him would be admitting failure." The man shrugged. "I'm Howard, by the way. Been working here 30 years. Seen 'em come and go." "I'm Emily. Just started today." Howard's eyes flickered to her belly, then back to her face. "Word of advice? Stay out of Mr. Blackwood's way. Do your job, keep your head down, and don't get attached to anything here. Nothing good comes from getting attached at Blackwood Estate." With that cryptic warning, Howard walked away, leaving Emily alone with Spirit. She approached the stall slowly, extending her hand palm up as she'd been taught to do with horses. Spirit regarded her for a long moment before stepping forward and gently pressing his nose against her palm. The touch sent a surprising wave of emotion through Emily: connection, understanding, a momentary sense of peace. "Nice to meet you too," she whispered. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The cabin creaked with unfamiliar sounds, and her mind raced with anxiety about what the morning would bring. She thought about the life growing inside her, the responsibilities ahead, and the precariousness of her situation. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep and stepped outside, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the spring chill. The stables were illuminated by a single security light, casting long shadows across the grounds. Drawn by an impulse she couldn't explain, Emily made her way to Spirit's stall. The white stallion was awake, his ears perking up when he saw her. "Can't sleep either, huh?" she murmured, reaching through the bars to stroke his nose. Spirit leaned into her touch. In the quiet of the night, Emily found herself talking to the horse, telling him about her fears, her hopes for her baby, the series of misfortunes that had led her to Blackwood Estate. Spirit listened with what seemed like genuine understanding, occasionally nudging her hand when she paused, as if encouraging her to continue. For the first time since arriving, Emily felt a small spark of hope. Perhaps this place could be a sanctuary after all, at least until the baby came. She made a silent promise to herself and her unborn child. They would endure, they would survive, and someday they would find a real home. What Emily couldn't see was the silhouette watching from the main house, a dark figure standing at the window of the upper floor, tracking her movements with cold calculation. The next few weeks fell into a routine. Emily rose before dawn, prepared breakfast for the workers, cleaned the main house under Margaret's critical eye, and spent her evenings in the stables. She learned that Richard Blackwood was often away on business, which suited her fine. The few times their paths crossed, his gaze lingered uncomfortably on her, his smile never reaching his eyes. Emily began carrying a small notebook, recording her days, her thoughts, and increasingly her observations about the estate. She noted the locked gates that seemed excessive, even for a property with valuable horses, the way communication with the outside world was limited to a landline in the main house, the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Small details that individually meant little but together formed a pattern that made her increasingly uneasy. Spirit became her confidant. Each evening, she would brush his coat until it gleamed, talking softly to him about her day. Sometimes she'd read aloud from dog-eared paperbacks she'd brought with her, her voice a gentle murmur in the quiet stable. The other workers noticed her attachment to the horse, but said nothing. Only Howard occasionally joined her, sharing stories about Spirit's younger days when he'd been the pride of the estate. "Used to be Mr. Blackwood's favorite," Howard told her one evening. "Until he wasn't. That's how things work around here. You're useful until you're not." One morning, as Emily was cleaning the library in the main house, the door opened and Richard Blackwood walked in. Tall, with silver-streaked dark hair and the lean build of a rider, he carried himself with the confidence of a man unaccustomed to being questioned. "Miss Matthews," he said, his voice cultured and smooth. "I hope you're finding your accommodations adequate." "Yes, sir, thank you for the opportunity." Emily kept her eyes lowered, focusing on dusting the bookshelves. "I've noticed you spending time with Spirit." He moved closer, his presence filling the room. "Interesting choice. Most people are drawn to the champions." "Spirit seems special," Emily replied carefully. Richard laughed, the sound lacking warmth. "He was once. Now he's just a reminder of deterioration. Everything deteriorates eventually, Miss Matthews. Everything loses its value." His eyes traveled over her pregnant form. "Almost everything." The implication in his words sent a chill down Emily's spine. She mumbled something about needing to finish her work and hurried from the library as fast as her pregnant body would allow. That night, Emily added a new entry to her notebook, describing the encounter and the growing sense of unease it had left her with. As she wrote, she realized something that should have been obvious from the start. There were no other women her age working at Blackwood Estate. All the stable hands were men, and the only other female employee was Margaret, who seemed more sentinel than housekeeper. Emily closed her notebook and placed it beneath her mattress, a decision forming in her mind. As soon as she had enough money saved, she would leave this place. Something wasn't right at Blackwood Estate, and she refused to wait around to discover exactly what it was. What she didn't know was how quickly that decision would be forced upon her, or the role that a white stallion named Spirit would play in what was to come. The Kentucky summer arrived with a vengeance, bringing sweltering heat that hung over Blackwood Estate like a heavy blanket. Emily's pregnancy advanced to 7 months, making her daily tasks increasingly difficult. The baby kicked more frequently now, especially in the evenings when she sat with Spirit, as if responding to the horse's calming presence. Richard Blackwood had returned from his business trip with renewed interest in the estate's operations and in Emily. He began appearing wherever she worked, offering unsolicited advice, standing too close, finding reasons to touch her shoulder or arm. His attention came with small gifts, a basket of baby items left at her cabin door, a rocking chair mysteriously appearing in her living room, prenatal vitamins she hadn't asked for. "Mr. Blackwood is being mighty generous," Margaret commented one morning as Emily prepared breakfast. The older woman's tone suggested this was unusual and perhaps concerning. "He's never taken such an interest in an employee before." "I didn't ask for his interest," Emily replied, keeping her voice neutral while chopping vegetables for omelettes. Margaret lowered her voice. "There was another girl before you, younger, not pregnant, but pretty like you. Came from a tough situation. Too." She glanced around nervously. "Left suddenly about 8 months ago. Mr. Blackwood said she got a better offer elsewhere, but she left all her things behind. Never even said goodbye to anyone." A cold feeling settled in Emily's stomach. What was her name? Jasmine Miller. Margaret seemed about to say more but stopped as the kitchen door swung open and Howard entered. The conversation shifted to safer topics, but Emily couldn't shake Margaret's words. That night, she added Jasmine Miller's name to her notebook, underlining it twice. The next day, she attempted to use the landline in the main house to call her former colleague from the hospital, only to find that outside calls required an access code she didn't have. "For security," Margaret explained when Emily asked. "Mr. Blackwood is very particular about communications. You can give me a message, and I'll see that it gets passed, along when I go into town for supplies." Emily thanked her but declined. The walls seemed to be closing in, a feeling intensified by her growing awareness of how isolated the estate was. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the private road to the main highway had a gate that remained locked at all times. Workers were transported to town once a week for supplies in the estate van, but Emily's pregnancy had been used as an excuse to keep her on the property for her safety. One evening, as Emily brushed Spirit, she heard footsteps approaching. Expecting Howard, she was startled to find Richard Blackwood standing at the stall entrance, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You have a way with him," Richard observed, nodding towards Spirit. "He was never this calm with anyone else." "Animals can sense when people care about them," Emily replied, continuing to brush the stallion. Richard stepped into the stall despite Spirit's ears flattening against his head. A warning sign Emily had learned indicated the horse's displeasure. "I've been thinking about your situation, Emily. May I call you Emily?" Without waiting for her answer, he continued, "A woman in your condition needs stability, security. The father of your child clearly isn't providing that." Emily said nothing, her hand stilling on Spirit's flank. "I could offer you a more permanent position here. A better cabin, better pay. You and your child would want for nothing." Richard moved closer, blocking the stall exit. "All I would ask is that you be appreciative of my generosity." The implication hung in the air between them. Spirit shifted nervously, sensing Emily's discomfort. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Blackwood," Emily said carefully, "but I've made arrangements to stay with my sister after the baby comes." It was a lie, but one she hoped would discourage him. Richard's expression hardened. "I wasn't aware you had family to turn to. How fortunate for you." His tone suggested he didn't believe her. "Still, my offer stands. Think about it." He reached out to touch her face, but before his fingers made contact, Spirit suddenly moved between them, his massive body creating a barrier. The horse snorted loudly, pawing at the ground in clear agitation. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Control that animal," he ordered. "He's just protective," Emily said, placing a calming hand on Spirit's neck. "Maybe we should continue this conversation another time." For a moment, tension hung in the air like the prelude to a storm. Then Richard stepped back, his charismatic mask sliding back into place. Of course, rest well, Emily. With a final, lingering look, he left the stable. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She paced her small cabin, one hand on her belly, the other clutching her phone that couldn't get a signal this far from town. She tried to rationalize her fears. Perhaps she was overreacting, her pregnancy hormones amplifying normal concerns. But the conversation with Margaret about Jasmine, the increasing isolation, Richard's thinly veiled proposition, these weren't hormones talking. At dawn, Emily made a decision. She packed a small bag with essentials, tucked her notebook inside, and waited for the estate to wake up. Her plan was simple: tell Margaret she needed to see a doctor in town due to pregnancy concerns, get a ride with whoever was making the supply run, and then find her way to a bus station. She had enough money saved for a ticket to Cincinnati, where a former colleague might be willing to help her until she could contact social services. But when she stepped outside her cabin, Richard Blackwood was waiting, leaning against a sleek black SUV. "Going somewhere?" he asked pleasantly, though his eyes were cold. Emily froze. "I need to see a doctor. The baby was moving strangely last night." "What a coincidence. I was just coming to check on you since Margaret mentioned you weren't feeling well yesterday." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'd be happy to drive you to town myself." Every instinct warned Emily not to get in a car alone with this man. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to inconvenience you. I can wait for the supply run." "I insist," Richard cut her off. "As your employer, your well-being is my responsibility. Besides, there's no supply run today." Emily clutched her bag tighter, mind racing for an excuse. "I should let Margaret know." "I've already informed her." Richard opened the passenger door. "Shall we?" Trapped, Emily took a step forward, then hesitated as a commotion erupted from the direction of the stables. Spirit had somehow freed himself from his stall and was galloping toward them, his white coat gleaming in the morning sun. Richard cursed under his breath, stepping away from the SUV to intercept the horse. Emily seized the moment, dropping her bag and running toward the stables. She heard Richard shouting behind her, but Spirit had created the perfect diversion, circling and blocking Richard's path each time he tried to follow. Emily reached the stables and ducked inside, heart pounding. Howard stood by the feed room, mouth agape at the sight of her desperate rush. "I need help," Emily gasped. "Mr. Blackwood, he's not who he pretends to be. I think I'm in danger, please." Howard's weathered face registered shock, then resignation, then determination. "The tack room," he said quickly. "There's a door that leads to the back fields. Go through it. Follow the creek bed east. It'll take you to the old Campbell property. Mrs. Campbell will help you." "What about Spirit?" Emily asked, hearing Richard's angry shouts growing closer. "Don't worry about that horse. He's smarter than most people around here," Howard pressed, a set of keys into her hand. "My truck's behind the feed silo. Take it, but leave it at the Campbell place. I'll say you stole the keys." Tears sprang to Emily's eyes. "Thank you." "Go," Howard urged. "And Emily, be careful who you trust. Blackwood has friends in high places." Emily slipped through the tack room and out the back door just as Richard entered the stables. The last thing she heard was Howard's calm voice. "Morning, Mr. Blackwood. Quite a commotion with Spirit today. Never seen him act like that before." Outside, Emily followed Howard's directions, moving as quickly as her pregnant body would allow, staying low in the tall grass that lined the creek bed. She could hear the distant whinny of a horse, Spirit, still creating a distraction. The thought gave her courage to keep going despite the growing ache in her back and fear coursing through her veins. After what seemed like an eternity, she reached the feed silo and found Howard's old pickup truck. The key slid into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. Emily drove away from Blackwood Estate, constantly checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see Richard's black SUV in pursuit. But no one followed. The dirt road eventually gave way to pavement, and Emily found herself navigating unfamiliar country roads, following signs toward what she hoped was the Campbell property Howard had mentioned. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, and the baby kicked insistently as if sensing her distress. "It's okay," she whispered to her unborn child. "We're going to be okay." What Emily didn't know was that her escape was just the beginning. Back at Blackwood Estate, Spirit had been corralled back to his stall. Howard was being questioned by a furious Richard Blackwood, and a man who was not what he seemed was about to arrive under the guise of treating a troubled horse. The wheels of exposure were already in motion, though Emily couldn't possibly know how her simple act of keeping a notebook would ultimately bring light to the shadows of Blackwood Estate. Nor could she have imagined that the connection she'd formed with the discarded show horse would prove to be the catalyzing force that would save not only herself and her unborn child, but others who had no voice. The Campbell property turned out to be a modest farmhouse surrounded by fields of wildflowers and a small apple orchard. Mrs. Campbell, Eleanor as she insisted Emily call her, was a silver-haired woman in her 70s with kind eyes and hands calloused from decades of farm work. She took one look at Emily's distressed state and ushered her inside without question. "Howard called me from the stable phone," she explained, setting a cup of chamomile tea before Emily. "Said you might be coming my way and needed a safe place." "You know Howard well?" Emily asked, her hands warming around the mug. Eleanor's expression darkened. "I know Blackwood Estate well. My family owned that land before Richard's father swindled it from us 30 years ago. Howard was our stable manager back then. He stayed on when ownership changed. Someone had to look after the horses." Over the next hour, Emily learned that Eleanor Campbell was more than just a neighboring farmer. She was a community pillar who had been quietly documenting Blackwood's questionable activities for years. The walls of her study were covered with newspaper clippings, photographs and notes detailing everything from labor violations to suspected environmental contamination from Blackwood's other business ventures. "There have been 3 young women before you," Eleanor said grimly, showing Emily a handwritten list. "All hired as house staff, all disappeared suddenly. Jasmine Miller was the most recent. Before her there was Alyssa Torres, and before that, Bethany Winters. All were vulnerable in some way. Financial troubles, family problems, nowhere else to go." Emily's hand instinctively went to her pregnant belly. "What happened to them?" "That's what we're trying to find out." Eleanor hesitated. "I've been working with someone, a federal investigator. He's been building a case against Blackwood for labor trafficking, intimidation, and creating conditions of involuntary servitude. Your testimony could be crucial." The idea of confronting Richard Blackwood in any capacity, even through legal channels, made Emily's blood run cold. "He's powerful, connected. Howard said he has friends in high places." "He does," Eleanor acknowledged, "which is why this investigation has moved so slowly. But you have something the others didn't." "What's that?" "Your notebook. Howard mentioned you've been documenting everything." Eleanor leaned forward. "And you have Spirit." "Spirit? He's just a horse." Eleanor's eyes twinkled. "That just a horse has quite a history. He belonged to Richard's first wife, Caroline. She was an accomplished equestrian who raised Spirit from a foal. When she filed for divorce after discovering Richard's true nature, he made sure she left with nothing, not even her beloved horse." Emily absorbed this new information. "Where is Caroline now?" "She passed away a few years ago. Car accident on a rainy night." Eleanor's tone suggested she had her doubts about the accident. "But before she did, she established a foundation for victims of domestic abuse. Her sister runs it now in Louisville. They've been quietly supporting our investigation." That night, Emily slept in a real bed for the first time in months, though her sleep was fitful and plagued by dreams of Richard Blackwood finding her. The next morning, over breakfast, Eleanor explained that the investigator, a man named Daniel Parker, would be arriving that afternoon under the guise of inspecting the property for agricultural compliance. "Richard knows Eleanor Campbell would never sell her land to him," Eleanor explained with a hint of pride. "So he's been trying to find code violations to force me out. Daniel has used this as his cover to move freely between properties in the area." When Daniel arrived, Emily was struck by how ordinary he looked. Average height, unremarkable features, the kind of face that wouldn't stand out in a crowd. A perfect quality for someone whose job was to observe unnoticed. "Ms. Matthews," he greeted her with a firm handshake. I understand you've had quite an experience at Blackwood Estate. For the next 2 hours, Emily shared everything. Richard's increasingly inappropriate behavior, the isolation tactics, Margaret's warning about Jasmine, the restricted communication, and finally, her desperate escape assisted by Howard and Spirit. Daniel recorded her statement and photographed her notebook entries. "This is exactly what we needed," he said, reviewing her documentation. Contemporaneous notes are powerful evidence, combined with financial records showing how he manipulates employee debts to prevent them from leaving. We're building a solid case. "What about the other women?" Emily asked. "Jasmine, Alyssa, Bethany?" Daniel's expression turned grave. "We've located Alyssa. She's in a therapy program in Ohio. Still too traumatized to speak about her experience. Bethany's family reported her missing, but the local sheriff, a hunting buddy of Blackwood's, dismissed it. And Jasmine?" He hesitated. "We're still looking." A heavy silence fell over the room. Eleanor placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "What happens now?" Emily finally asked. "Now we move you somewhere safe until the case breaks," Daniel replied. "We have a women's shelter in Cincinnati that works with our agency. You'll have access to prenatal care, counseling, job training, everything you need until the baby comes." Emily felt a wave of relief, followed immediately by concern. "What about Howard? He risked everything to help me." "Howard's been our inside contact for months," Daniel assured her. "He knows how to handle himself around Blackwood, and now that you're safe, we're accelerating our timeline." Daniel explained that while Emily had been at Blackwood Estate, he had visited several times posing as a potential buyer for one of Richard's prized thoroughbreds. He'd planted electronic surveillance in the main house and gathered evidence of tax fraud, illegal labor practices, and witness intimidation. "Tomorrow, I'm going back as a veterinary specialist," he continued. "Blackwood requested an expert evaluation of a dangerous horse that attacked him. Apparently, Spirit didn't just create a diversion for you, he physically prevented Blackwood from pursuing you." Emily felt a surge of affection for the white stallion. "What will happen to Spirit? If all goes according to plan, we'll execute search warrants within the week. All the animals will be evaluated and arrangements made for their care." Daniel's expression softened. "I'll make sure Spirit is taken somewhere safe." That night, as Emily prepared for her journey to Cincinnati the following day, she couldn't stop thinking about the white stallion who had somehow sensed her danger and acted to protect her. She thought of his intelligent eyes, his gentle nudges when she spoke to him, the way he had positioned himself between her and Richard Blackwood. There had been something almost human in his understanding. The next morning, as Eleanor helped, Emily packed the few belongings she had fled with. The phone rang. Eleanor answered, her expression quickly shifting from curiosity to concern. "It's for you," she said, handing the receiver to Emily. "It's Howard." Emily's heart raced as she took the phone. "Howard, are you okay?" "Not much time." Howard's voice was hushed and urgent. "Blackwood knows you're at Campbell's. He just got back from the sheriff's office. They're coming with papers, claiming you stole property, that you're mentally unstable because of your pregnancy." Emily's knees weakened. "But that's not true. Daniel said—" "Daniel's cover is blown," Howard cut in. "Someone tipped Blackwood off. He's ordered Spirit to be put down, claiming he's dangerous after attacking him. They're preparing the injection." "Now, no," Emily cried. "Howard, you have to stop them." "I'm trying, but I don't have much leverage here. Listen carefully. In Spirit's stall, there's a loose board in the back wall. Behind it is a package Caroline left years ago. Insurance, she called it. Documents, photos, a flash drive. Evidence. She was gathering against Richard before her accident. Get it before they destroy the stable." "Destroy the stable? What do you mean?" "There's a plan to have an electrical fire tonight. Too many secrets in this place. Just get here, get the package and get out. I'll make sure Spirit is ready." The line went dead. Emily turned to Eleanor, who had heard enough to understand the situation had drastically changed. "We need to call Daniel." "Already dialing," Eleanor said, phone in hand. "But his team is in Louisville today. They won't get here in time." Within minutes, they had formulated a desperate plan. While Eleanor created a diversion by confronting Richard and the sheriff at the main entrance to Blackwood Estate, her rights as a neighboring property owner would force them to at least hear her complaints. Emily would slip onto the property through the old creek bed trail, retrieve Caroline's hidden evidence, and somehow help Howard save Spirit. As Eleanor drove them toward Blackwood Estate in her weathered pickup truck, Emily felt the baby shift inside her, a reminder of everything at stake. She placed a protective hand over her belly. "I promise you'll never have to be afraid like this," she whispered to her unborn child. "We're going to stop him. For Jasmine, for Alyssa, for Bethany, for all of us." What Emily couldn't have known was that at that very moment, Richard Blackwood was sitting in his study, scrolling through security camera footage that had captured her escape 2 days earlier. His face twisted with rage as he watched Spirit repeatedly blocking his path to Emily, the horse moving with an almost uncanny intelligence. On the desk before him lay employee files, including one for a veterinary specialist named Daniel Parker, who was scheduled to examine Spirit that afternoon. Beside it was a report from a private investigator revealing Parker's true identity as a federal agent. And next to that was a folder marked Caroline, a collection of newspaper clippings about his former wife's fatal car accident, mechanical failure suspected but never proven. Richard reached for the phone. "Is everything prepared for tonight?" he asked when the call connected. "Good. And the horse?" He listened, then smiled coldly. "No, I want to handle Spirit personally. After the vet examines him, of course. We need to maintain appearances." As he hung up, Richard failed to notice the small blinking light on his desk phone, a sign that the call, like every call made from that office in the past month, had been recorded by devices planted during Daniel Parker's previous visits. The evidence was mounting, but the question remained, would it be enough and would it be discovered in time? Back in Eleanor's truck, Emily steeled herself for what was to come. She had never considered herself brave, but thinking of her child's future, of Spirit's loyalty, of Howard's risk in helping her, she found a reservoir of courage she hadn't known existed. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just her fate, but the fate of everyone caught in Richard Blackwood's web of control and intimidation. Eleanor's truck rolled to a stop just beyond the tree line that bordered Blackwood Estate. Through the windshield, they could see the main gate where a sheriff's cruiser was already parked next to Richard's black SUV. "Remember," Eleanor said, squeezing Emily's hand, "you have 30 minutes at most. Get the evidence, find Howard, and get out through the east boundary where Daniel's colleague will be waiting. If you're not there by 4:30, they'll come looking for you." Emily nodded, her throat tight with fear and determination. "Be careful with the sheriff. Howard said he's Blackwood's friend." "Sheriff Jenkins has known me since he was in diapers," Eleanor replied with a fierce smile. "His mother was my best friend. He may be in Richard's pocket, but he won't risk hurting me with witnesses around." She nodded toward a news van pulling up to the gate, part of Daniel's contingency plan that had been set in motion the moment Howard called. 30 seconds later, Eleanor was marching toward the main gate, her voice carrying clearly across the grounds as she demanded to speak with Richard Blackwood about water rights and property line violations. The local reporter, sensing a story involving one of the area's wealthiest men, eagerly approached with a microphone, while the cameraman filmed. Using the distraction, Emily slipped into the creek bed that ran along the property's edge. Her 8-month pregnant belly made the journey more difficult than it had been days earlier, but determination propelled her forward. She moved as quickly as possible while staying low in the tall grass, following the path toward the back of the stables. As she approached the building, Emily could see unusual activity, workers removing equipment and files, loading them into trucks. Howard had been right. They were clearing out, preparing to destroy evidence. Her heart pounded as she waited for a break in the movement, then darted across the open space to the stable's rear entrance. Inside, the familiar smell of hay and horses calmed her racing pulse slightly. Most of the stalls were empty. The valuable thoroughbreds had already been moved. Emily made her way toward Spirit's stall at the far end, freezing when she heard voices approaching. "Blackwood wants it done now, before that vet shows up," a man was saying. Said to tell you it's a liability issue. Doesn't seem right, replied a voice Emily recognized as one of the stable hands. That horse never hurt nobody before. You want to tell Blackwood that. Be my guest. Just get the injection ready. Emily pressed herself into an empty stall as the men passed. Once they were gone, she hurried to Spirit's enclosure. The white stallion was still there, his ears perking up at the sight of her. He nickered softly, moving to the stall door. "Hey there," she whispered, reaching through the bars to stroke his nose. "I'm going to get you out of here." Emily opened the stall door and stepped inside, moving to the back wall where Howard had described the loose board. She found it easily, slightly discolored from the others, with nail heads that protruded, just enough to grip. Pulling it free revealed a small cavity containing a waterproof bag. She had just secured the package in her jacket when the stall door creaked. Emily whirled around, expecting to face one of Blackwood's men, but it was Howard who stood there, his weathered face etched with urgency. "You got it," he said, noting the bulge in her jacket. "Good. Now we need to move. They've called in a vet tech to euthanize Spirit. Blackwood convinced the sheriff that he's dangerous, attacked him unprovoked." "That's a lie," Emily protested. "Of course it is. But with you gone and labeled as unstable, who's going to dispute it?" Howard handed her a lead rope. "Can you still ride?" Emily looked at Spirit's tall frame doubtfully. "At 8 months pregnant?" "Not far. Just to the east boundary. I've got a horse trailer waiting with a friend. We'll get Spirit out, then come back for the evidence once you're safe." The sound of a vehicle approaching spurred them into action. Howard quickly fitted Spirit with a simple halter and attached the lead rope. "Go out the back, follow the old training path. It's marked by white stones. My friend Jackson will be waiting with his trailer. He worked here before Blackwood took over. He'll get Spirit somewhere safe." "What about you?" Emily asked, suddenly reluctant to leave the old man behind. "I've got one more thing to do here." Howard's eyes were determined. "Caroline was my friend too. I promised her I'd make sure the truth came out someday." A door slammed in the distance. "Go now," Howard urged, helping Emily climb onto Spirit's bare back. The position was awkward, with her pregnant belly, but the white stallion stood perfectly still, seeming to understand the need for caution. With a final nod to Howard, Emily guided Spirit through the back door and onto the training path. The white stones were easy to follow, gleaming in the afternoon sun. Spirit moved carefully, his gait smooth and measured as if conscious of his precious cargo. They had gone perhaps half a mile when Emily heard the sound of an engine behind them. Glancing back, she saw Richard Blackwood's black SUV bouncing along, the rough path gaining on them quickly. "Go, Spirit," she urged, leaning forward to grasp his mane. The stallion needed no further encouragement. He surged forward, powerful muscles bunching as he lengthened his stride. Despite his years, Spirit ran with the heart of a champion, each hoof beat eating up the distance toward the boundary. The SUV gained ground on the uneven terrain. Emily could now see Richard's face through the windshield, contorted with rage. The boundary was just ahead, a simple wooden fence with a gate, but the SUV was too close. In that moment, Spirit did something extraordinary. Instead of heading for the gate, he veered sharply left toward a fallen log that paralleled the fence. Before Emily could process what was happening, the stallion gathered himself and soared over the obstacle in a perfect arc, landing smoothly on the other side of the boundary. Richard's SUV skidded to a halt at the fence line. He threw open the door and stepped out, his face livid. "You think this changes anything?" he shouted. "You're trespassing on my property, stealing my horse. Sheriff Jenkins has already signed the papers to have you committed for psychiatric evaluation." Emily turned Spirit to face Richard across the boundary. Strange calm had settled over her. "Not your horse," she called back. "Caroline's horse. And I have her evidence too. Everything she gathered before you arranged her accident. It's over, Richard." The color drained from Richard's face. "You're lying. That evidence was destroyed years ago." "Caroline was smarter than you gave her credit for. She kept copies." Emily patted the package in her jacket. "Documents, photos, testimony from the women you victimized before me. Your empire is finished." Richard's expression shifted from shock to calculation. "Be reasonable, Emily. Whatever Caroline thought she had, it's ancient history. I can make this worth your while. Think about your baby. You'll need security, stability. I'd rather live in a shelter than take anything from you, Emily replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The sound of vehicles approaching from both directions interrupted their standoff. From one side came a horse trailer, from the other, several unmarked cars with federal agents, including Daniel Parker. Behind them was Eleanor Campbell's pickup, with Eleanor herself at the wheel. Richard glanced at the approaching vehicles, then back at Emily. For a moment she thought he might run. Instead he reached into his jacket. Spirit reared suddenly, placing his body between Emily and Richard. The movement unbalanced her, and she slid from the stallion's back, landing awkwardly on the ground. Pain shot through her as she tried to protect her belly from the impact. What happened next occurred in a blur. Richard attempted to climb the fence, but Spirit charged forward, forcing him back. Federal agents swarmed the area, ordering Richard to the ground. Eleanor and Daniel rushed to Emily's side as she clutched her stomach in pain. "The baby," she gasped. I think it's coming." Within minutes, Emily was in an ambulance speeding toward the nearest hospital, Eleanor holding her hand and assuring her everything would be all right. Behind them, the scene at Blackwood Estate transformed into a full-scale federal operation. Search warrants executed, employees questioned, evidence gathered from the main house and outbuildings. And at the boundary line, a white stallion stood watching the ambulance disappear, his mission complete. 16 hours later, Emily Matthews gave birth to a healthy baby girl she named Caroline Spirit Matthews. As mother and daughter rested in the hospital room, Daniel Parker arrived with news. "Richard Blackwood is in federal custody," he reported. "The evidence you recovered was everything we needed and more." Caroline had documented decades of abuse, financial crimes and witness intimidation. Howard filled in the rest. "He's been working with us from the beginning, gathering evidence since he promised Caroline he'd help expose Richard someday." "And Spirit?" Emily asked, cradling her newborn. "Safe. At a horse sanctuary in Lexington," Daniel replied with a smile. "Howard's friend Jackson got him there before Blackwood's men could do anything. The sanctuary is actually funded by Caroline's foundation. They're expecting you and little Caroline Spirit when you're ready." 3 months later, Emily stood at the fence of a lush green paddock, her daughter secured in a carrier against her chest. The sanctuary spread out before them. Rolling hills, clean barns, horses grazing peacefully. Eleanor Campbell stood beside her, having become a surrogate grandmother to baby Caroline. "He's coming," Eleanor said, pointing to a figure on the horizon. A white horse galloped across the field, his coat gleaming in the sunshine, head held high with a dignity that no amount of previous neglect could diminish. Spirit slowed as he approached, nickering softly as he recognized Emily. "There he is," Emily whispered to her daughter. "The one who saved us." Spirit approached the fence, gently pressing his nose against the baby's tiny hand. The infant gurgled and smiled, her fingers instinctively curling around the soft muzzle. "The trial starts next month," Eleanor commented. "Howard says with your testimony and Caroline's evidence, Richard Blackwood will never hurt another woman again." Emily nodded, thinking of Jasmine Miller, whose body had been found buried on the remote edge of Blackwood Estate during the federal search. She thought of Alyssa Torres, who had finally found the courage to tell her story when she learned she wasn't alone. She thought of Bethany Winters, now reunited with her family after years of believing she had abandoned them. "Some people were asking if we want to buy the estate now that it's being liquidated," Eleanor continued. "Turn it into an extension of the sanctuary, a place for healing." Emily considered this as she watched Spirit playfully toss his head, showing off for the baby. "I think Caroline would have liked that," she said finally. "A place of fear becoming a place of healing." As the sun began to set over the Kentucky hills, casting long shadows across the sanctuary grounds, Emily felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been harrowing, but she had found her strength, her voice, and her purpose. Most importantly, she had found a family, not one bound by blood, but by something just as powerful: shared survival, mutual protection, and unconditional love. In the paddock, Spirit pranced and circled, his movements telling a story of freedom and joy. Emily smiled, remembering how a connection with a discarded show horse had changed everything. She had gone to Blackwood Estate looking for temporary shelter, but had found instead a path to lasting justice. And Spirit, once valued only for ribbons and trophies, had proven his true worth in courage and loyalty. As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the Kentucky sky, Emily made a silent promise to her daughter. She would grow up knowing that true strength comes in unexpected forms, that justice may be delayed but is never denied, and that sometimes salvation arrives on 4 legs with knowing eyes and a gentle heart. For Richard Blackwood, the final irony was that the creature he had discarded as worthless had ultimately been his undoing. For Emily and Caroline Spirit Matthews, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one written not in fear but in hope. And in his spacious paddock, with the night breeze ruffling his white mane, Spirit stood watch, sentinel, protector, friend, a living testament to the power of connection that transcends words, crosses species, and changes lives forever.